When news of the catastrophe at Lake Trasimene reached Rome, the Senate had no choice but to inform the Roman people, because such a one-sided loss could not be concealed. A Roman official announced to the Roman crowd, quote, "We have lost a great battle." The people of Rome were stunned, as they had never seen a Roman army so totally and completely annihilated. The Romans were used to their armies pounding their enemies into the ground. But Hannibal represented something they had never experienced before. The Senate immediately convened about what to do next. Now, just when Rome thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. Fresh news arrived of yet another setback. Servilius had sent 4,000 of his cavalry to assist Flaminius. But by the time they had arrived, Flaminius had already been defeated. Hannibal immediately dispatched his cavalry and some infantry to meet the Roman task force. The Romans were routed, losing half of their force. The rest were soon taken prisoner. Rome descended into chaos after the latest incident. The consular system was suspended and a dictator was elected. Only in times of crisis was a dictator elected, and that time had arrived. The dictator would have total power, and all of his decisions were final and were not subject to approval from the Senate. Consuls, on the other hand, needed approval from the Senate before a campaign. In fact, the dictator was so powerful that the power of all officers in Rome was removed, except for the tribunes that represented the people. The man selected as dictator was Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius had a great reputation in Rome, and so he was given the task to deal with Hannibal. Polybius indicates that Maximus was added at a later time, and that it stood for greatest. Marcus Minucius Rufus was appointed as Master of the Horse. The Master of the Horse was the dictator's second in command. Fabius took command of 4 new legions that were raised. He also relieved Servilius from his command and assumed command over his legions as well. Meanwhile, after Hannibal's victory at Trasimene, the road was effectively open to Rome. But it was never Hannibal's intention to lay siege to Rome itself. That would be costly and might open him up to a dangerous counterattack. His primary mission was to capture war booty and to convince as many city-states as he could to leave the Roman Confederacy. And so he headed into Apulia, which was located in southern Italy. Polybius indicates there was so much booty taken that his army could not possibly transport it all. Once in southern Italy, he gave his army some much-needed rest. He provided fresh weapons to his army units and also dispatched a messenger to Carthage. This brought the Carthaginian Senate up to date on the recent events. Meanwhile, Fabius marched his army out of Rome and marched south, camping close to Hannibal. Hannibal didn't waste any time and decided to test his new adversary by offering up a battle right away. But Fabius failed to appear, and so Hannibal retired back to camp. Fabius developed a strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal at all costs. At first, many Romans thought this was cowardly, but eventually many Romans conceded that this probably was the best way to deal with the ever-dangerous Hannibal. And after all, Hannibal had defeated every Roman army thrown his way. Fabius was inclined to simply shadow Hannibal, keeping a watchful eye on the Carthaginian army. And so he shadowed Hannibal for weeks. In fact, Fabius was so careful that no one was allowed to leave the camp for any reason. This was not much of a problem since the Romans were well supplied. Hannibal still had to forage. Fabius also marched in close formations and only picked off enemy stragglers when the opportunity presented itself. And so Fabius hoped to defeat Hannibal through a very long war of attrition. This avoidance strategy has since been referred to as the Fabian Strategy. It was a new system of war for Rome. Meanwhile, Hannibal tried every tactic in the book to lure Fabius into battle, but at every turn Fabius exercised extreme caution. Hannibal had hoped to sway the population in Apulia to his side, but he found only disappointment in this regard. The cities in Apulia stayed loyal to Rome. Rome, for the most part, had been quite gentle in dealing with her Italian allies, and many saw the Carthaginians as invaders rather than liberators. And so Hannibal decided to move into Samnite territory, where he overran several cities, and even seized several Roman supply depots. Fabius continued to maintain a safe distance and still refused to fight Hannibal in a pitched battle. Hannibal now made an audacious move heading into Campania. Polybius states that Hannibal had 2 primary objectives. First, this would compel the Roman army to fight, or if they refused, this would cause cities to join his cause after they saw how weak Rome was, especially since the Romans refused to fight him and let the pillaging go on unanswered. Campania was one of Rome's most prized possessions, as it was an economic powerhouse. Its coastal region was home to many of the most important ports in Italy, and so Hannibal began to plunder the plain in Campania and perhaps capture Capua. The move was seen as risky since there are only a few routes out of Campania. Fabius, though, was more than content to keep shadowing his enemy. Minucius and the army thought they had Hannibal trapped, and that Fabius now had the perfect opportunity to descend into the plain and confront Hannibal. To appease some of his deputies, Fabius moved closer, but still maintained a strong position on the high ground, deciding not to descend into the plain. Fabius wanted to remain in the hills where it would be more difficult for the Carthaginian cavalry to attack him. Meanwhile, Hannibal was up to his usual tactic of laying waste to everything around him, hoping to lure Fabius into a fight. But it must have been clear to Hannibal by now that he was dealing with a far more measured Roman general. Soon, however, an opportunity presented itself to Fabius. Hannibal had intended to leave Campania the same way he entered. This was a very narrow pass that could easily be defended by a small force, and so Fabius placed 4,000 of his troops in the pass. Hannibal marched his army right up to the foot of the pass and camped there. Fabius now believed it was the right time to attack Hannibal, with the Romans occupying the high ground and the Carthaginians hemmed in down in the plain below. And so he began to make preparations. But Hannibal had a good idea of what the Romans were planning and decided to thwart their plans. He ordered his men to gather 2,000 oxen that had been captured. Then during the night he gave a strange order to tie pieces of torchwood to the horns of the oxen. The torches were then lighted and the oxen driven up a slope that was close to the pass. A small force of Carthaginians escorted the cattle up the nearby trail. Meanwhile, the Roman troops guarding the pass assumed the lights approaching the other slope were the Carthaginians, and so they left the pass to defend the other slope. As they drew near the cattle, the lights puzzled the Romans about what was going on. Meanwhile, Hannibal ordered his entire army into the pass the Romans had just vacated, and the elaborate ruse was complete. From his own camp, Fabius could see something strange had transpired, but Fabius decided to stay put as he feared this was another Hannibal trap. Meanwhile, the Romans on the other ridge were fighting the Carthaginians who had escorted the cattle. Hannibal sent reinforcements to assist them, and 1,000 Romans were killed. All of the Carthaginians then returned to the main army, and Hannibal was able to safely break out of the plain. This incident caused Rome to lose faith in Fabius and his defensive policy. So much so that some Romans referred to Fabius as Hannibal's Lackey, but we can assume that Hannibal himself must have held Fabius in high regard. Hannibal now had to find a strong place to set up winter quarters for the winter. This was necessary since Hannibal had been unable to secure any Italian allies as of yet, despite the fact he had marched all around Italy. His scouts located a town called Uranium, which was located back in Apulia. Hannibal attempted to negotiate a surrender, but when the town refused his offers, he put all of the town's inhabitants to the sword. He decided to set up the entire town as one large granary, and he built his camp in front of the town. He then decided to set up foraging parties and to harvest the surrounding farmland. This was done since he didn't want to use up all of his livestock, so the strategy was to gather as much grain as possible. Each day, 2/3 of the army was sent out to forage. If enough grain was gathered, he would be able to feed not only his men, but also his livestock for the winter. Meanwhile, Fabius had gone back to Rome and had left his deputy, Minucius, in charge. Fabius left strict orders not to engage Hannibal. Minucius, though, was unable to resist the temptation, moved his camp close to Hannibal's position. Here he began to harass Hannibal's foragers. In response, Hannibal constructed a temporary camp close to the Roman camp. The Romans won a minor skirmish against the Carthaginians, and for a few days at least, Hannibal cut back on his foraging operations. Meanwhile, Minucius stayed put in his camp. This put Hannibal in a dilemma. His army could not afford to stay in their camps and consume supplies, so Hannibal was eventually forced to send out parties in increasing numbers for foraging. Minucius now realized that a majority of the Carthaginians were out foraging, so he boldly led his army out and approached the enemy camp. He had the heavy infantry form up at Hannibal's camp, while the cavalry and light infantry were divided into units and sent out after the foragers, with orders to take no prisoners. In a rare move, Hannibal was caught off guard since he didn't have enough troops in camp to fight the Romans. Hannibal was barely able to save the camp and was buying as much time as possible until 4,000 foragers returned. When the relief force arrived, Hannibal offered battle, but by that time the Romans had retreated. But in the process, the Romans had killed or captured many Carthaginians. After this incident, Hannibal was more careful with his foraging operations, while according to Polybius, the now confident Romans became more and more careless. Hannibal also realized he was in a bad situation, with his army divided into two camps. Hannibal decided it wise to fall back to his main camp. When news of the success reached Rome, there was euphoria. They admired Minucius for his boldness, and were equally critical of Fabius and his avoidance strategy. So in one of the more bizarre turn of events in Roman history, Minucius was also appointed dictator. So now there were two Roman dictators? Wasn't there only supposed to be one guiding the overall strategy? Fabius was convinced Minucius had not really accomplished anything against Hannibal, other than killing a few foragers, and so he decided to stick with his avoidance strategy. The two dictators argued constantly over their respective strategies. Fabius finally offered a compromise. First, they could go back to the consular arrangement where the two generals rotated turns as overall commander. Second, the two generals could simply divide up the army and use their legions as they saw fit. Minucius chose option 2, and the Roman dictators established their own camps. Now, of course, all of this discord between the Roman dictators was a situation just waiting to be exploited by Hannibal, and he soon learned of the dissent between the two Roman leaders, and that Minucius was hoping to seek a pitched battle. Hannibal decided to use this against Minucius and occupied a hilltop close to his camp. Under the cover of darkness, Hannibal hit about 5,000 infantry and 500 horse. Minucius took the bait and dispatched his skirmishers against the hill. Hannibal had enough forces to fight a stalemate on the hill. This caused Minucius to send the Roman cavalry up the hill, which Hannibal immediately countered with his own cavalry, again seeking a stalemate. Soon, however, the Carthaginian cavalry drove back the Romans. Minucius now marched his 4 legions up the hill, but the Roman cohesion was broken up by the retreat of the Roman skirmishers and cavalry, who were now being driven back by the Carthaginian cavalry. At that moment, the concealed Carthaginian forces ambushed the Romans, and many of the Romans broke ranks and fled, while the others were being surrounded and fighting for their very lives. Another Roman disaster once again loomed. Fabius could see what was happening from his camp and marched out with his 4 legions. Minucius and his forces formed up next to Fabius's legions. In an interesting move, it was Hannibal who now decided to play it safe, and he fell back to his camp. The Romans, now unified under one camp, and a now humbled Minucius, decided to turn over supreme command to Fabius. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians dug a ditch and palisade all the way from their captured hill back to their camp. Now back in Iberia, things were going better for Rome. Hasdrubal and Gnaeus Scipio met near the Ebro River with both land and naval forces. Scipio was able to rout Hasdrubal at sea, forcing Hasdrubal to call off a planned attack north of the Ebro. This news delighted the Roman Senate, especially after all the major setbacks in Italy. They were now determined to defeat the Carthaginians in Iberia as a means of putting more pressure on Hannibal. They dispatched Publius Scipio, whose original mission had been Spain, before getting sidetracked with Hannibal's crossing over the Alps. Scipio arrived and managed the campaign jointly with his brother. Now, for the first time, the Scipios pushed south of the Ebro towards Saguntum. Here they found some Iberians that joined the Roman cause. They informed the Romans that the Carthaginians were holding several Iberian children as hostages at Saguntum. This was done to keep Iberia loyal. A Carthaginian traitor handed over these children to the Romans, who were camped near Saguntum. The Romans immediately restored the Iberian children to their parents, thus earning the good graces of many Iberian towns. The Campanian season, though, came to an end with the onset of winter, and both sides set up winter quarters. For the year 216 BC, the Romans elected new consuls, and the Roman dictators resigned. So far, Hannibal had secured major victories, but had been unable to sway any of the Italian city-states to his side. He hoped another major victory against the Romans would see some of Rome's allies join Carthage. This would lead up to one of the worst disasters in Roman history, and we will get to that in the next video.